It was a cold, dark night, and I was on my way back to the city after a long day of visiting family upstate. The bus was mostly full, with people like me who were just trying to get home. Exhausted, I found some comfort in the warmth inside the bus as we rolled through the quiet countryside. The gentle hum of the engine and the rhythmic bumps of the road were almost enough to lull me to sleep. The driver, an older man with a stern expression, had been quiet for most of the journey, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. No one was in the mood to chat. It was late, and the night outside was pitch black, with only the occasional streetlight piercing the darkness. We had been on the road for about an hour when I noticed something odd. The bus seemed to be picking up speed, and I could see the faint glimmer of railroad tracks ahead, the warning lights just starting to flash red. A chill ran down my spine, and I glanced around at the other passengers. Most were oblivious, either dozing off or lost in their phones, but a few had noticed it too. The lights were flashing, and the crossbar was starting to lower, but the driver wasn't slowing down. In fact, he was speeding up. A wave of panic washed over me. I could see the tracks clearly now, and my heart began to race as the bus hurtled toward them. The flashing red lights seemed to blur as they reflected off the windows, creating a dizzying effect. I wanted to scream, to yell at the driver to stop, but the words caught in my throat. And then it happened. The bus lurched forward as the driver floored the gas, trying to beat the lowering crossbar. The screech of the bus tires against the pavement filled the air, mingling with the relentless clanging of the warning bells. We were almost there, almost across, when the crossbar slammed down, trapping us on the tracks. Time seemed to slow down. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I turned to look out the window. To my horror, I saw the headlights of an oncoming train, piercing through the darkness like the eyes of some monstrous beast. It was coming from the north, its horn blaring in the night, a sound so loud it seemed to vibrate through my entire body. People started screaming. A woman sitting near the front, one of the passengers, was shouting at the driver, her voice shrill with panic, but I could barely hear her over the chaos. The driver was frantically trying to reverse the bus, his face pale and drenched in sweat, but the gears seemed to jam, and the bus refused to move. The train was getting closer. I could see the individual cars now, illuminated by the harsh lights, and I knew we didn't have much time. My mind raced, a million thoughts flashing through my head. My family, my friends, my life. Everything seemed to blur together as I braced myself for the impact. But just as suddenly as it began, the nightmare shifted. The train passed by us in a blur of metal and noise, but it was the wrong train, the northbound train. The bus shook violently as the train whipped past us, just inches away, the sheer force of it rattling the windows. I could feel the wind it generated, cold and harsh, cutting through the bus like a knife. We had been trapped on the southbound tracks. For a moment, everything was silent. The bus was still, the passengers were frozen in their seats, and even the woman who had been shouting had gone quiet, her hands gripping the seat in front of her like a lifeline. The driver was breathing heavily, his eyes wide as he stared at the tracks ahead, his hands still clenched around the steering wheel. Then, as if waking from a nightmare, he threw the bus into reverse, and we finally moved off the tracks. The crossbar lifted, and we rolled back onto the road, away from the railroad crossing. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the distant echo of the train horn, fading into the night. I didn't sleep for the rest of the ride. No one did. We all just sat there, staring out into the darkness, shaken to our cores by how close we had come to disaster. When we finally reached the city, I stepped off the bus with trembling legs, the cold night air biting into my skin. As I walked away, I glanced back at the bus one last time, my mind replaying those terrifying moments on the tracks. I couldn't shake the image of the train, bearing down on us like a harbinger of doom, and the thought of what could have happened if the driver hadn't reversed in time. It was a night I would never forget, a brush with death that still haunts me every time I see those flashing red lights at a railroad crossing. It had been a long day, and all I wanted was to get home. The bus ride was the last leg of my journey, and I was grateful to have found a seat near the front. The rain was pouring outside, the kind that made you want to curl up in bed and listen to it drum against the window. The bus was half empty, with only a few scattered passengers. A man in a suit reading something on his phone, an elderly woman clutching a bag of groceries, and a teenage girl with her nose buried in a book. I put on my headphones and leaned back, trying to relax as the bus bumped along the wet streets. A few stops later, the man got on. He was tall, with a trench coat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. He looked out of place, too formal for the casual, late-night crowd. He walked past me without a glance, his shoes squeaking on the wet floor, and took a seat a few rows back. I didn't think much of it at first, but something about him caught my attention. Maybe it was the way he sat, stiff and upright, or the fact that he kept his hat on even inside the bus. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my music, but every now and then I found myself glancing back, just to make sure he was still there. As the bus continued on its route, the rain intensified, turning the windows into a blur of water and light. The bus made several stops, and soon it was just me, the man, and the teenage girl left. She got off at the next stop, leaving me alone with him. The bus was silent, except for the sound of the rain and the occasional squeak of the wipers. I couldn't see the man's face, but I could feel his eyes on me. I shifted in my seat, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that was creeping over me. Then I noticed something strange. The bus wasn't stopping. We had passed several stops without slowing down, the driver seeming oblivious to the normal route. I stood up, intending to ask the driver what was going on, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of the man in the back. He was watching me, his head slightly tilted, as if waiting for something. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. The driver was just a few steps away, but the man's gaze held me in place. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my instincts screaming at me to sit back down, to not draw attention to myself. But I couldn't ignore it any longer. I walked up to the driver, trying to keep my voice steady. "Excuse me, why aren't we stopping?" The driver didn't answer right away. He glanced at me in the mirror, his eyes flicking to the man in the back before settling on the road again. "We're going straight to the depot," he said, his voice flat. End of the line. Panic gripped me. The depot was miles away from my stop, in a part of town I didn't know. I turned to look at the man, but he was already standing, making his way toward the front of the bus. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. The streets outside were deserted, and the rain was coming down in sheets, making it impossible to see anything clearly. The man reached into his coat, and for a moment, I thought he was going to pull out a weapon. But instead, he handed the driver a piece of paper. The driver glanced at it, nodded, and then turned to me. "You should sit down," he said, his voice cold. It really freaked me out. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me to run, to get off the bus at the next stop. But there was no next stop. The bus was heading straight into the darkness, and I was trapped. The man didn't sit back down. Instead, he stood in the aisle, blocking my way to the door. I could feel the tension in the air, the sense that something terrible was about to happen. My hands shook as I clutched my bag, trying to think of a way out. Then, without warning, the bus jerked to a stop. The doors hissed open. I gathered all my courage, bolted for the door, pushing the man back. I jumped off the bus into the pouring rain. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached a well-lit street, my clothes soaked through, and my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I finally dared to look back, the bus was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. I never found out who that man was or what he wanted, but I never took that route again, and to this day, the sound of rain on a bus window sends chills down my spine. The night was eerily quiet when the bus came to a sudden, jarring halt. I had been dozing off, lulled by the monotonous hum of the engine and the gentle sway of the bus as it wound through the dense woods. But now, as the vehicle shuddered and went still, my eyes snapped open. The only sound was the soft rustle of leaves outside and the occasional creak of the bus as it settled into the silence. I glanced around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The other passengers were stirring as well, murmuring in confusion. The driver, a grizzled man in his 50s, muttered something under his breath and stepped out of the bus to check the engine. We were deep in the woods, far from any town or help, with nothing but the dark silhouettes of trees surrounding us. The minutes ticked by, and the unease inside the bus grew thicker with each passing second. Someone tried to use their phone, but there was no reception. Not a single bar. We were completely cut off, stranded in the middle of nowhere. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic clank echoed through the night, followed by the driver's frustrated cursing. He climbed back onto the bus, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "The engine's shot," he announced grimly. "We're not going anywhere until help arrives." A collective groan rose from the passengers. It was late, pitch black outside, and now we were stuck in the middle of the woods with no cell service. The air inside the bus felt thick with anxiety, and I could see people shifting uneasily in their seats, glancing nervously at the windows. As we settled in for what we knew would be a long wait, the atmosphere grew tense. Every small noise seemed amplified in the oppressive quiet of the forest. The occasional rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Each sound made me jump, my nerves already on edge. The darkness outside felt like it was pressing in on us, wrapping the bus in a shroud of uncertainty. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere in the woods. The sound was so faint at first that I thought I might have imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. The other passengers heard it too, and a ripple of fear swept through the bus. "What was that?" someone whispered, their voice trembling. No one answered. The driver, who had been leaning back in his seat, suddenly sat up, his eyes narrowing as he peered out into the darkness. "Probably just an animal," he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Then came the rustling, much closer this time. The sound of something large moving through the underbrush, snapping twigs and crunching leaves underfoot. It was coming closer, moving slowly but deliberately toward the bus. Panic started to set in. A woman near the front of the bus clutched her child to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. A man a few seats behind me muttered a prayer under his breath. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the adrenaline surging through my veins. The noises grew louder, more distinct. It was no longer just rustling. Now there were low growls, almost like the sound of an animal stalking its prey. My mind raced with possibilities: wolves, bears, something worse? Whatever it was, it sounded too close for comfort. I kept my eyes glued to the windows, straining to see through the darkness. For a moment, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow darting between the trees, something large and fast. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination or if something was really out there, but the terror that gripped me was all too real. The bus suddenly felt like a flimsy barrier between us and whatever was lurking outside. The windows, once a source of comfort, now felt like a vulnerability. I could hear the others whispering frantically, the tension mounting with each passing second. Then, out of nowhere, there was a loud thud against the side of the bus. The impact was so strong that the whole vehicle shook, and everyone inside screamed in unison. I turned toward the source of the sound, my heart nearly stopping in my chest. It was as if something had thrown itself against the bus, something heavy and powerful. The driver jumped out of his seat and grabbed a flashlight, his face pale but determined. "Stay inside," he barked before opening the door and stepping out into the night. I wanted to call out to him, to tell him not to go, but my voice caught in my throat. We all watched in terrified silence as the beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty woods. Minutes passed like hours. The driver's footsteps crunched on the gravel outside as he circled the bus, shining his light into the shadows. But whatever had hit the bus was gone now, leaving nothing but a few deep scratches on the metal. The tension inside the bus was almost unbearable, the fear so thick you could taste it. When the driver finally climbed back inside, he was shaking his head. "I didn't see anything," he said, his voice strained. "But we need to stay calm and stay inside until help arrives." His words did little to ease our nerves. We all huddled in our seats, our eyes darting around the dark forest, our ears straining for any sign of movement. Every rustle, every creak, sent a fresh wave of terror through us. Hours passed in agonizing silence, the fear gnawing at us like a hungry beast. We were trapped, helpless, waiting for something to happen. The sounds outside seemed to grow fainter, but the fear lingered, refusing to release its grip. A pair of headlights appeared down the road, growing brighter as a large truck pulled up beside the bus. It was the tow truck sent by the bus company. The driver quickly opened the doors and we scrambled out, desperate to leave the bus and the horrors of the night behind. As we were loaded into the tow truck's cab, I glanced back at the bus, now bathed in the harsh light of the tow truck's beams. For a moment, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the woods, but when I blinked, it was gone. We were taken to a nearby town, where we spent the rest of the night in a small, brightly lit diner, trying to shake off the terror of what had happened. No one spoke much. We were all too shaken by the experience.